Hello, this is Pastor Bob, and I'm inviting you today to consider a critical question. I use that term because when I was a missionary in Eastern Europe, we had an opportunity to minister to people from a lot of different languages and a lot of different religious backgrounds, people from many countries. So we had an opportunity to study the Bible together and to talk about some of the important questions. And one of those questions was whether or not a man is actually religious by nature. And a lot of people say, no, he's not religious by nature. In fact, you probably have heard someone who has, in a course of conversation, has said, well, I'm not a religious person, but, and then he goes on and makes a comment of some kind. And so we really need to deal with that because it deals with the very nature of man. What is man? You know, why is he here? Is he religious by nature? And so if he is religious by nature, then you have to ask the question, why? And did he become religious simply because he was trained to do that? Did he have to acquire that religious mindset? Or is it something that happened to him naturally? And if he is religious by nature, then what kind of religion does he practice? And we're going to talk about that in another session a little bit later. But many years ago, over 1600, 1700 years ago, there was a great teacher in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean countries. And he came on this very same issue because he said he was going into a particular city. Actually, it was the city of Athens in Greece. And he had spent some time there, and while he was there, he had an opportunity to interact with a lot of the different leaders in the city. And he had some who were highly intellectual. He had others that were very, very political minded. But there was one thing that they always did, and they invited him after they'd heard him make some rather amazing statements. They invited him to join them because they wanted to sort of inquire from him and debate him. And so as he met together with them on what was called Mars Hill, just outside, just on the edge of the city, it was a place that they always gathered to debate various political and moral and ethical issues. And so when he finally arrived at their request, one of the first things he said was, I'm really impressed with your city, and I see how religious you people are. And of course that kind of struck their minds, but what had happened was he had seen so many different gods that they were referring to and that they were worshiping, all these different idols to gods. And this story is actually about the Apostle Paul, and it's found over in the 17th chapter of the book of Acts. And I just wanted to read this to you right quickly because he stood, it says in verse 22 of Acts chapter 17, Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in every respect. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I've also found an altar with this inscription, To an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. And then he goes on and he describes to them and talks to them about this God that was very, very different and one that they didn't know anything about. And so we come to this question, and we have to deal with the fact, how did these people become so religious? How did they end up with all of these different gods? And this raises an interesting question because you see a lot of people consider themselves to be secularists. A lot of them say they're atheists, which of course is similar to secularism. There are other people that are agnostics. They're not sure there's a God, but they would like to know if there is or not, but they kind of doubt that there is. And then you have all these other different religions. You have religions, Buddhism, you have Hinduism, you have Islam, you have Judaism, pantheism, all of these different things that we'll look at in a later session. But there are some the basic principle that we need to look at and that we need to understand right now is we have to ask ourselves the question, is man religious by nature? And if he is, why is he religious by nature? Is this something as I said earlier, that he has to acquire? Is it something that's part of his natural birth? Is there a DNA inside him that causes him to be religious without having to even work at it? Or is he religious because he was raised in a religious family of a particular religious persuasion? And so a lot of people get away from that and simply say, no, man is not religious. In fact, most secularists will say that. They'll say man is an animal being. He has a soul or a personality, but he has no propensity toward worship of any kind, toward religion. And so if that's the case, then I would like to maybe ask a few questions here that I've jotted down. If man is not religious by nature, doesn't have to work at it, if he's not religious by nature, then why are there more than 50,000 religions plus around the world? And many of those religions have many gods. For example, in India, there are reportedly over 3 to 3.5 million different gods in India alone. So if man's not religious by nature, how did that happen? Or we might even ask, then how come we have all these religious icons and religious idols scattered around the world? Doesn't matter what country you go to, whether it is a most primitive, undeveloped country that is yet to be discovered by man, or whether it's one of the most advanced and highly educated, you always find, wherever you go, you find statues, idols, sacred sites, and all of this type of thing. So if man is not religious by nature, then why are they there, you see? I mean, we need to really be honest with ourselves in this. Another question is, if man is not religious by nature, then why is there such an emphasis on the spiritual world, particularly in the area of witchcraft and the occult and astrology and so forth and so on like that? If man's not religious by nature, he shouldn't need any of that stuff. And yet, we find that it exists in our country today. Another question that I like to ask people is, well, if you're not religious by nature, then why do you use God's name in vain in your swearing? I mean, if you're not a religious person, why would you even use that? Why couldn't you come up with some other terminology to express your exasperation and your anger or your frustration? Another question is why, if man is not religious by nature, then why do you have centuries of poets and writers and musicians who have referenced and have written songs and poems and essays and even novels and great works of art like Aristotle and Plato, who made clear reference over and over again to the religiosity of man? So I mean, these are just some of the questions that I think we really need to come to grips with. For example, if man is not religious by nature, then why did we have religious wars? If there's no religion, then you don't need to fight a religious war. And yet mankind's history is filled with one event after another of religious wars. The most well-known probably are the Crusades back during the 11th century and the 12th century. Why did the Greek writers, such as Aristotle and Plato, why did they acknowledge the existence of gods? Why does Greek mythology talk so much about gods? If man is not religious by nature, you don't need any of that sort of stuff. And why does every major culture, this is very interesting to me, you go back and look at all the different cultures of mankind and you'll discover that in almost every single one of them you have a religious story that includes the creation of man by some religious or spiritual being. And then you have all these different stories that go along besides that. You have the story of the flood. There's a flood story in almost every cultural history. And it almost always involves the presence of some deity. And so Then another question I would have is, if man isn't religious by nature, then why did so many ancient kings like Belshazzar and Julius Caesar and others demand that people bow down and worship them, or bow down and worship an idol in their likeness? If man's not religious by nature, why would they have ever thought of that? And why would the people have done it? You see, it's a question that only has one logical conclusion, and that is, man is indeed religious by nature. Now, when I started studying this and sharing this a number of years ago in Eastern Europe with many of the students that came to study the Bible and to study other issues, I ran across some quotes, and I just jotted some of these down. And I want you to just hear what some other people over the centuries have had to say. One is Simon Greenleaf. Now Greenleaf was an 18th century lawyer from England. And here's what he said. This is a man who's an attorney. He says that man is a religious being is universally conceded, for it has been seen to be universally true. All across the world, man is religious by nature. Here's a Jewish writer, Uri Geller. He says, I am a religious man. I'm Jewish, but I believe in all religions. I believe in God, and I see him as an old man with a big white beard and pray to him every day for a few minutes. Now, we may laugh about that, but the key point in what he said is he is a religious man, and he believes in all religions. 19th century Native American Indian named Charles Eastman says the Indian was a religious man from his mother's womb. And we could just talk about, here's one that's even from Buddha. Buddha himself, who's the founder of Buddhism, he says, just as a candle cannot burn without fire, man cannot live without a spiritual life. Or how about Christopher Hitchens? Everybody knows who he is. He's the British author who wrote the book God is Not Great. And he says religion, now this is a man who's an out-and-out atheist, and he says religion is a part of the human makeup. It's also part of our cultural and intellectual history. Religion was our first attempt at literature, the texts, our first attempt at cosmology, making sense of where we are in the universe, our first attempt at health care, believing in faith healing, and our first attempt in philosophy. Or let's look at the great scientist Albert Einstein. He says true religion is real living, living with all one's soul, with all one's goodness and righteousness. Here's William O. Douglas. William O. Douglas was an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And it says, he writes, we are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being. Heinrich Heine, who's a German poet from the 19th century, every man, either to his terror or consolation, has some sense of religion. And I could go on. Here's one. I found this one particularly interesting. This man is a Muslim. Ibrahim Kenan, who's a Turkish professor of Hadith at a university in Istanbul. And he said, man is religious by nature. There are some people who feel to be far away from religion. However, he cannot be freed from natural religiousness. God Almighty, who created us in need of religion. God who created us in need of a religion. Nobody is freed from this natural need. Well, Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French mathematician, said, there's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man that cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God, the Creator, made known through Jesus. And then the last thing I'll mention of all these quotes is that in 2011, just a few years ago, Rutgers University professor Christina Chu wrote a blog. She had been doing some research on whether or not man was religious by nature. And she basically said, we humans have a predisposition to believe in some kind of divine being and in the afterlife. In other words, to be religious. Such beliefs are indeed a part of what makes us human and are innate rather than learned. In other words, you don't acquire religious feelings, you are born with them. There is something inside constantly crying out to worship something or someone. She goes on to say it's simply a part of being human. Then in Oxford University in England, there were several years ago, a bunch of researchers, about 57 researchers, spent 3 years and they looked at over 40 different studies from 20 different types of countries and cultures, and they came up with this conclusion. This was the conclusion of all these researchers and scientists. 57 researchers got together and, believe it or not, agreed on one thing. And here's what their report said. Humans are predisposed to believe in both God and an afterlife, and both theology and atheism are reasoned responses to what is a basic impulse of the human mind. And as a part of that, Professor Roger Trigg from the University of Oxford's Ian Ramsey Center, he concluded with these words. He says, religions are likely to be short-lived as human thought seems to be rooted in religious concepts because religion is, quote, a common fact of human nature across different societies. So, is man religious by nature? Yes, he is. So, that raises two questions. Number one is, why is he religious? And the second question is, if he is religious, what religion is he going to accept? Because as I said, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of religions. Well, the answer as to why man is religious is found, I think, in one very, very important truth, and that is that man was created for God. And we see this. In fact, if we were to look in the book of Romans, Paul the Apostle, maybe 10 years after he stood and spoke with those intellectuals in Athens on Mars Hill, he wrote then to the Christians in Rome. And in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18, he starts out and he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that, and this is it, get this, that which is known about God is evident, not to them, it is evident within them. For God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. And then he goes on and describes what man is like when he refuses to accept the fact that he is a religious being, and when he refuses to accept the fact of God being God. So, are you religious by nature? Well, many times you may not think you are. But deep inside you, just like part of your DNA, there's something inside that cries out for some kind of relationship. Jessie Penn Lewis was a British writer of the 19th century, and she made this interesting observation. She said, the only decision that man ever really has the freedom to make in his entire life is the decision to choose his God. So you are religious, whether you feel like it sometimes or not. And you are a religious person because God created you that way. So that brings us then to the question of, okay, then which religion will you follow? Which God will you worship? There are many gods, there are many religions, but you were created for Him. And in the next session, we're going to look at that and see just exactly why we were created for God and what is so unique about us in the way that God created us. So in the meantime, have a great day, and we'll talk to you again.